The first thing I did was grab my car keys. But then I remembered my car was still at the mechanic. I cursed under my breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Sarah was half asleep on the couch, her hands still pressed against her stomach. The soft rhythm of her breathing, mixed with small whimpers, she couldn't hold back. I called a cab, pacing the floor while waiting for it to arrive. Every second felt like an hour. When the headlights finally appeared outside, I wrapped Sarah in a coat and helped her to the door. She could barely stand. Her skin was cold and damp, her face pale under the porch light. I whispered that we were going to the hospital, that everything would be okay. Though deep down I wasn't sure I believed it. The ride felt endless. The cab smelled faintly of cigarettes and cheap air freshener, and the driver kept glancing at us through the mirror, probably trying to guess what had happened. Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered that she was sorry for waking me. Sorry. The word cut through me like glass. I told her to stop apologizing, to just breathe. But her tears soaked through my sleeve. The hospital's fluorescent lights hit my eyes as soon as we arrived. I half-carried Sarah through the sliding doors, calling for help. Dr. Leticia Figueroa was on duty that night. She took one look at Sarah and didn't waste time asking questions. Within minutes, nurses surrounded her, guiding her into an examination room. I stood outside the door, my heart pounding, listening to the muffled sounds of medical equipment and quiet instructions. When the doctor came out, her face was tight with concern. She said there were several contusions. No fractures for now, but she needed to run a few scans to be sure. I nodded, trying to focus, but my thoughts were spiraling. The words mistress and husband echoed in my head like an accusation. When I finally went back into the room, Sarah's face was turned toward the wall, eyes open but empty. The nurse was cleaning her wounds gently, talking to her in a calm voice. Sarah didn't respond. I sat down beside her and reached for her hand. It felt so small in mine, so fragile. I told her that she didn't need to speak, that I already knew enough. The silence in that room was thick, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the monitor and the low hum of the lights. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an unknown number, but I knew who it was. I didn't answer. The message that followed confirmed it. A warning, just like the one on Sarah's phone. My throat tightened, but I refused to show fear. I turned off both phones and focused on her. By the time the doctor finished, it was close to dawn. She said Sarah could go home if she rested and avoided stress. I thanked her quietly and helped Sarah into another cab. The sky was pale gray, the kind of early morning light that makes everything look colder. When we got back home, I tucked Sarah into bed, covered her with a blanket, and sat beside her until her breathing slowed and she finally fell asleep. Her face looked peaceful for the first time, though the bruises told another story. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee, but the cup trembled in my hands. I stared out the window and saw my neighbor, Camila, sweeping her porch. She noticed me and came over, worry etched on her face. She said she had heard the knocking last night, the crying, and asked if everything was all right. I told her as little as I could, but her eyes filled with fury when I mentioned Robert. She said no man had the right to treat his wife like that. How? Then she paused and said something that changed everything. Her security camera pointed directly at my front door. Maybe, she said. It recorded what happened. My heart skipped. She took out her phone, opened the app, and there it was Sarah, barely standing, knocking at my door, her voice trembling in the night. I asked her to send me the footage. and she did without hesitation. That small act of kindness felt like a light in the darkness. When I went back inside, I stood before my closet and stared at my uniform, hanging neatly in place. The blue shirt, the khaki pants, the belt, the badge. It all seemed to look back at me. I reached out, my fingers brushing over the fabric, and I could almost hear my own heartbeat echoing through the room. I realized I had two choices. I could stay silent. I hope the wounds healed. Pretend it would never happen again. Or I could use everything I had: my badge, my training, my will to make sure it never did. The choice wasn't hard. I closed the closet door, turned off the light, and whispered to myself that by sunrise, this would no longer be just a mother's story. It would be the beginning of a reckoning. The morning air was heavy, still carrying that strange quiet after a sleepless night. I sat at the kitchen table with my badge lying beside my coffee mug, staring at it like it could tell me what to do next. Every sip tasted bitter. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Across the hall, Sarah was asleep. Her face turned toward the window where thin sunlight filtered through the curtains. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath a reminder of how close I had come to losing her to something I couldn't even name. I opened my notebook, the same one I used for work, and began to write dates, times, details, everything she had told me, everything I had seen. The bruises, the swelling, the messages on her phone. Evidence, I thought. I wasn't just her mother anymore. I was an officer gathering proof of what had been done. My heart ached with every word I wrote, but it gave me something to hold on to. Around 8 o'clock, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months, James Ellison, a lawyer who had once worked with me on a case years ago. He sounded half awake when he answered, but the moment he heard my tone, he straightened up. I told him briefly what had happened, that I needed legal protection for Sarah and guidance on how to proceed. He didn't ask questions, just said he would come by that afternoon. When I hung up, I felt a flicker of strength return. It was faint, but it was there. I went into Sarah's room again. She stirred as I brushed her hair from her forehead. Her face looked softer in the daylight, but the bruises still glowed dark under her skin. I told her to rest, that I had things to take care of. She nodded weakly, her eyes half open, and I could see the confusion behind them, fear mixed with disbelief. How had her life, once full of love and plans, become this? I didn't have an answer. So I just kissed her forehead and stepped out quietly. The neighbor, Camila, came by again with a tray of breakfast she had made for us. Her presence filled the room with warmth I didn't know I needed. She told me she had saved a copy of the security footage and that no one else had access to it. I thanked her, promising to use it carefully. She placed a gentle hand on my arm and said she trusted me to do the right thing. Her confidence gave me courage. When she left, I plugged the small USB she had given me into my laptop. The screen flickered, and the video appeared. It was short, barely 2 minutes long, but it was enough. Sarah, barely standing, knocking on the door in the dark, her faint voice calling for me. I had to pause the video halfway through because my hands were trembling too much. I closed my eyes and let the sound of her voice replay in my head, a reminder of why I couldn't stop now. I copied the file, saved it in 3 different places, and hid one copy in a folder labeled Old Invoices. The years of police work had taught me one thing: never underestimate what desperate people can do once they realize they're being cornered. I looked around my house. Every object seemed charged with new meaning: the framed photo of Sarah's graduation. The clock ticking in the living room. Even the chair where she had sat crying only hours ago. The smell of coffee had turned cold. But I didn't care. I pulled open the drawer where I kept my camera and extra memory cards. That camera had captured crime scenes, accidents, moments that marked the end of someone's peace. Now it would tell my daughter's story. I went to her room, careful not to wake her, and began taking photos. Each click echoed through the quiet house. Her injured lip, the bruised eye, the marks on her wrists. I documented everything. Not out of cruelty, but out of duty. Each photo was proof that what she had endured was real, that she hadn't imagined it, that someone would have to answer for it. When I finished, I sat down beside her bed, exhaustion settling in like a heavy fog. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel everything. I had been holding back: the anger, the helplessness, the guilt. I remembered when Sarah was little, running through this same hallway barefoot, laughing as I chased her with a towel after her bath. That laugh had once filled this house. Now the air was thick with silence. I took her hand, whispering that I would fix this, that she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. The promise felt both sacred and dangerous. I stood up, put the camera back in its case, and opened my laptop again. It was time to start the plan. James and I had discussed years ago but never used a legal strategy built for women who had been silenced. As the files loaded, I felt something steady settle in my chest. The mother who had spent the night weeping was gone. The officer in me was awake now. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into soft darkness, and said quietly to the sleeping girl on the bed that justice was already on its way. By the time James arrived, the house smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The morning sun had grown stronger, casting lines of gold across the wooden floor. He was a tall man, slightly graying. With that steady calmness lawyers often carried like armor. When I opened the door, he studied my face for a moment and didn't need to ask if things were serious. I led him into the living room, where the folders and laptop were spread across the table. The screen was still paused on the security footage from Camilla's camera. He watched it once, quietly, hands clasped, then turned to me with a slow nod. "We can build from this," he said, his tone firm. "But we'll need medical reports, photographs, messages, and anything that proves control or intimidation." I handed him everything I had already gathered. He looked impressed but concerned at how quickly I had organized it all. I told him that being a cop doesn't stop when you hang up the uniform. He gave a faint smile and said it was good. I was channeling that energy into something that mattered. Then his face turned serious again. He warned that this would get ugly, that men like Robert rarely gave up quietly. I already knew that. I'd seen it too many times before. Watching cases unravel because fear silenced the victims. I wasn't going to let that happen here. After he left, I went to check on Sarah. She was awake, sitting up in bed, her hair tangled, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. She looked so much younger than her 20-something years, almost like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares. I sat beside her and told her that I had called James, that we were taking the first steps toward something bigger than just punishment. It was about truth. She nodded weakly, but didn't say much. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, the same way she used to when she was nervous as a child. I told her she didn't need to be brave right now, that it was my turn to carry the weight for both of us. She looked up at me, eyes glassy, and whispered that she just wanted to disappear. That sentence broke me inside, but I didn't let her see. I held her hand, squeezing gently until she stopped shaking. I reminded her that she was still here. Still breathing. Still strong. Even if she couldn't feel it yet. Later that afternoon, I drove to the station to pick up copies of a few documents I might need. Walking through those doors felt strange. I had worked there for more than 15 years. Yet that day, the air felt heavier. The chatter of officers more distant. No one knew what had happened. And I wasn't ready to tell them. I just nodded to the ones who greeted me and went straight to my locker. Inside, my uniform hung perfectly pressed, untouched since the night before. The badge gleamed faintly under the dim light. And for a moment, I hesitated. That badge had always been a symbol of order and fairness. But today it felt personal. Almost sacred. I clipped it to my belt before leaving. On the way home, I stopped by a small diner. I hadn't eaten since the previous night. The smell of coffee and eggs filled the place, and the hum of casual conversation almost made me forget for a second what I was living through. But then I saw a man at the counter who looked too familiar, one of Robert's drinking buddies. My chest tightened. I paid quickly and left without finishing my meal. Outside, the sunlight burned bright, but the air felt cold against my skin. When I returned home, Sarah was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face drained of color when I asked if she was reading messages from Robert. She hesitated, then handed me the phone. There were missed calls, voicemails, and texts filled with guilt and manipulation. One message read that she was destroying their marriage by involving her mother. Another tried to convince her it had been just an argument, that he loved her, that she was overreacting. I could almost hear the rehearsed charm in his words. In the same tone he used the first time I met him years ago. I deleted the messages and told her he didn't love her, he loved control. She looked away, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. I wanted to hold her, to take the pain away. But I knew this was something she had to face one day at a time. I told her the truth. That healing wasn't just about the body. It was about reclaiming her voice. She nodded slowly, still lost in her thoughts. As the sun began to set, I sat at my desk, typing out a formal report. It was a habit from my years on duty, record everything before memory softened it. The sound of the keyboard filled the silence, steady and rhythmic. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. I attached copies of the hospital report, the photos, and the video. Each file was another layer of protection between Sarah and the man who thought he could break her. When I was done, I saved everything onto a flash drive and placed it inside the drawer beneath my old revolver. I locked it, exhaled, and looked around the quiet house. The smell of soup drifted from the kitchen. Camila had dropped off dinner earlier. I hadn't eaten it yet, but knowing it was there brought a small comfort. I poured myself a glass of water, stared out the window, and whispered a prayer I hadn't said in years. Not for revenge, but for strength. Tomorrow, I told myself, would be the real beginning. But deep down, I also knew something darker. Robert wasn't going to let go easily. I could almost feel it in the air, heavy and certain, like the calm before a storm. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face under the porch light, her lips trembling as she begged me to open the door. The image looped in my mind like a silent film that refused to stop. The house was dark and still, the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest. I sat in the living room, the clock ticking loud enough to feel like it was keeping time with my heartbeat. I stared at the framed photo of Sarah and Robert on their wedding day, sitting on the shelf, They had looked so happy, so certain of their future. I remembered how he had held her hand then, the way he had looked me in the eye and promised to take care of her. My stomach turned. I reached for the photo, hesitated for a moment, and then turned it face down. The sound of the frame touching the table felt final. Just as I stood up to head to bed, my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number appeared. Short and cold. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. I'd seen intimidation before, from men who thought fear was power. But this time, it wasn't a case file. It was personal. I walked to my bedroom, opened the drawer where I had locked the flash drive, and checked it. Still there. I slid the drawer shut and turned the key. For the first time in years, I wished I wasn't alone in this house. But loneliness had a way of sharpening resolve. I took one last look at the dark window before lying down beside my badge on the nightstand. Sleep didn't come. Instead, thoughts ran wild. How to protect Sarah. How to expose Robert. How to make sure the system didn't fail her like it had failed so many others. By morning, exhaustion clung to me like fog. I brewed coffee strong enough to cut through the heaviness in my head. The smell filled the kitchen, and for a brief second, I felt normal again. Sarah came out of her room slowly, wrapped in a blanket, her hair messy, her eyes swollen. She sat at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug without drinking. She whispered that she had dreamt of Robert pounding on the door, calling her name. I told her it was just the mind trying to make sense of fear. She nodded, her voice small as she said she didn't know who she was anymore. I reached across the table and told her that what she had gone through didn't define her. That survival itself was strength. She looked at me for a long time before saying that she wanted to tell the truth, no matter how painful it was. That was the first real spark of the daughter I used to know. Later that day, James called to say he had spoken with a judge about filing for a protection order. He said it would take a few days. But in the meantime, we needed more concrete evidence of Robert's behavior. I told him I already had the video and photos, but he said we needed something undeniable, something public. His words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. I knew exactly what he meant. Robert was the kind of man who presented himself as charming and successful. The type neighbors respected because they only saw his polished side. If we were going to expose him, we needed to show what hid behind that charm. That evening, as the sun dropped low and shadows stretched across the living room floor, I opened my laptop again and began searching. I knew his patterns. I knew where he went when he thought no one was watching. Old instincts from my years on the force guided me: names, places, times. I pulled up local surveillance maps and bar listings, cross-referencing them with his known contacts. It didn't take long. There was one place that came up more than once: a small bar near the highway. Quiet enough for secrets, noisy enough to hide them. I stared at the screen for a while, weighing my options. Going there would mean crossing a line. Not as a mother, but as an officer. Still, lines stopped meaning much when your child's pain sat 2 rooms away. As I prepared to leave, Camila knocked on the door with a casserole dish in her hands. She said she thought we could use something warm for dinner. I thanked her, and she looked at me closely. Noticing the tension, I couldn't hide. She asked if I was planning to do something dangerous. I forced a small smile and told her I was just doing what needed to be done. She didn't press. But before leaving, she squeezed my hand and said to be careful. Her kindness steadied me in a way I didn't expect. When the door closed, I stood there for a long time, holding the dish in my hands, the warmth of it grounding me in the moment. I left the house an hour later, dressed in plain clothes, a jacket that hid my badge but not my purpose. The sky was deepening to a bruised purple, the kind of evening where everything felt suspended. I parked 2 blocks away from the bar, letting the engine fade into silence. From the car window, I could see the dim red sign flickering above the entrance. I waited. People came and went, laughing, smoking, unaware of the stories unfolding around them. My hands gripped the camera resting on the passenger seat. My pulse matched the rhythm of the flickering light. It wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. Then, through the crowd, I saw him, Robert, stepping out of his truck, his arm draped around a woman in a red dress. The world seemed to narrow into a single point. I lifted the camera, adjusted the lens, and pressed the shutter. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but to me, it thundered like justice, calling my name. I stayed in the car, the camera steady in my hands, watching through the windshield as Robert and the woman laughed together under the neon glow. Her red dress caught the light like a warning flare, and his arm never left her waist. For a moment, the noise from the bar drowned everything else out, the clinking of glasses, on the hum of a jukebox, but all I could hear was Sarah's voice from that night, trembling as she said he had chosen someone else. My chest tightened. Every picture I took felt heavier than the one before. I zoomed in, making sure to capture his face clearly, the license plate of his truck, in the way he looked at her with the same affection he once used to manipulate my daughter. The evidence was undeniable. Still, my hands shook when I lowered the camera. No amount of proof could erase the image of what he had done. They went inside the bar, and I waited. My breath fogged the window as I stared at the door, every muscle tense. After an hour, they came out again, stumbling slightly, laughing too loud for the quiet street. They got into the truck, his hand resting on her thigh as if the world belonged to him. I followed them at a distance, headlights off, keeping to the shadows. My old car rattled against the uneven road, but the night covered the sound. They stopped at a small roadside motel, the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be seen. I parked across the street, heart pounding, and took a few more photos as they entered. Robert held the door open for her like a gentleman in some cruel parody of decency. I sat back in the driver's seat, exhaling slowly. I had what I needed. It wasn't triumph. I felt it was something darker, a mix of exhaustion and rage. I stayed a few minutes longer, watching the red motel sign blink on and off, and then drove home through the empty streets. When I got back, the house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I took off my jacket and placed the camera on the table. My fingers were stiff from gripping it too tightly. I connected the memory card to my laptop, and the screen filled with images, his truck, his face, the woman's red dress under the streetlight. Every frame told a truth I already knew, but seeing it in front of me made it real. I created a folder labeled Evidence and locked it with a password. Then I printed a few key photos and slipped them into a file. The printer's steady rhythm sounded like a heartbeat. When the last page slid out, I turned off the light and sat in the dark, staring at the faint glow of the laptop screen. The night felt endless, but for the first time, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. The next morning, I called James and told him I had more than enough. He listened quietly as I explained what I had found. He said it was dangerous to confront Robert yet, that we should build a legal wall before making our move. I agreed. But part of me couldn't wait. patience had never been my strength, especially when it came to protecting someone I loved. After the call, I made breakfast for Sarah. She walked into the kitchen wearing one of my old sweaters, her hair still uncombed, but there was a bit of color in her face again. I told her to sit down, poured her tea, and placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of her. She thanked me softly, barely meeting my eyes. I could tell she sensed something had shifted. I said we had evidence now, that the truth was on our side. She looked up, her eyes filling with tears she didn't want to shed. She whispered that she was scared. Not of Robert this time, but of what would come next. I told her fear was a sign that we were doing something brave. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move through it. After breakfast, I went to the backyard to clear my head. The morning air smelled like wet soil and smoke from someone burning leaves nearby. The world seemed almost normal again, the kind of quiet that felt like a lie. I looked down at my hands, steady now. No more shaking, and realized how far it'd come since that night. I wasn't just a mother reacting to pain anymore. I was a woman reclaiming her ground. The sound of my phone pulled me back. It was a call from Commander Rosales, an old friend from the force. He said, had heard whispers about Robert's temper and offered to keep an eye on things if needed. I told him I might take him up on that. After we hung up, I went back inside and found Sarah asleep on the couch, the blanket tangled around her. I stood there for a long time, watching her breathe, thinking about all the mothers who had sat like this, watching over the broken pieces of the people they loved. That night, as I filed the evidence and prepared the written report for James, I realized something that made my hands go still. The fight ahead wasn't just about proving what Robert had done. It was about every woman I'd ever seen walk into a police station with fear in her eyes and walk out with a silence that no report could fix. I closed the file and whispered into the empty room that I wasn't going to fail this time. For Sarah. For myself. For all of them. But as the clock struck midnight, I heard a sound outside, a car engine idling for too long near the curb. I went to the window and pulled the curtain slightly. A silver truck sat under the streetlight. Headlights off. My pulse quickened. I didn't need to see the license plate to know whose it was. The silver truck stayed there, unmoving, its outline barely visible under the flickering streetlight. I stood behind the curtain, holding my breath, every nerve on alert. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the headlights flashed once, twice, like a taunt, before the engine roared to life and the truck pulled away into the dark. I let the curtain fall back into place, forcing myself to stay calm. Fear would only cloud my judgment. I checked the locks on every door, then went to Sarah's room. She was still asleep, her breathing steady, her body curled under the blanket, like a child hiding from a nightmare. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her for a long moment. She didn't need to wake up and see me shaken. I tucked the blanket tighter around her and whispered that everything would be fine, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. I went back to the living room and turned on the small lamp by the sofa. The soft light felt like company. I sat there, staring at the stack of folders and the camera resting on the table. Every piece of evidence I had collected was solid, but Robert was bold, reckless. If he knew I was building a case, Ted tried to destroy it, or, worse. I took out my phone and called Rosales. He answered immediately, his voice rough with fatigue but alert. I told him about the truck, that I was sure it was Robert watching the house. He didn't doubt me. He said send a patrol to circle the block through the night, and advised me not to go outside alone. His calm steadiness helped steady me too. I thanked him, then hung up and exhaled slowly. The night went quiet again. The clock ticked. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. By dawn, the tension in my chest had turned into determination. The light through the window was pale blue, the kind that makes everything look honest. I brewed fresh coffee and sat at the table reviewing the documents. The protection order James had filed was still pending. But with the new photos, it would only be a matter of time. I organized each folder carefully: medical records, photographs, text messages, the video from Kamala's camera. The weight of the evidence made the table creak slightly, and I took that sound as a sign that we were ready to move forward. When Sarah woke up, I told her to get dressed. She looked confused at first, but I explained that we were going back to the hospital for a follow-up exam. Her stomach bruises worried me. She nodded, too tired to argue, and slowly got ready. At the hospital, Dr. Figueroa greeted us with the same calm professionalism as before. She examined Sarah carefully, noting the fading bruises, but also the deeper emotional signs: tension in her posture, the flinch at sudden sounds. She said recovery would take time, both physically and mentally. When she left to print the new report, Sarah turned to me, her eyes full of uncertainty. She asked if we were doing the right thing, if pushing this further would only make things worse. I told her that silence was what made things worse. That truth was the only way to stop men like Robert. She nodded slowly, staring at her hands. I could see the doubt still lingering, but behind it was something else: resolve, beginning to form like the first light through clouds. Back home, I called James again and told him about the truck outside the night before. He wasn't surprised. He said intimidation was a common tactic when an abuser felt cornered. He told me to keep documenting everything, even small details. Then he hesitated, his voice lowering as if he were thinking ahead. He said we had built a strong case already, but if we wanted to ensure conviction, we needed to show a pattern, a history of deceit, manipulation, and greed. That meant digging deeper into Robert's finances and personal records. I asked how. He said he had someone who could help quietly, a contact at the property registry. My pulse quickened at that. I didn't know it yet, but that call would open the next chapter of our fight. That evening, I was sitting in the living room, sorting through receipts and phone bills, when my phone rang again. The number on the screen was one I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end made my heart stop. It was Romero Alcazar, an official at the registry whom I knew from a case years ago. His tone was cautious, his words deliberate. He told me he had seen my name and Sarah's on a property transfer file from the previous week, land that used to belong to my late father. He said the papers had been signed over to a woman named Denise Salgado. My blood ran cold. Sarah and I hadn't signed anything. I asked if he could send me a copy. He agreed, but warned that something about the file seemed off, that I should come by in person. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall. For a long minute, I couldn't move. I had thought Robert's betrayal had already hit its peak. I was wrong. He wasn't just trying to break my daughter's spirit, he was trying to erase our family's legacy. I grabbed my keys and jacket and told Sarah I needed to run an errand. She looked at me, worry flickering in her eyes, but I told her not to wait up. As I drove toward the registry office, the late afternoon light turned orange, painting the streets in long shadows. My hands gripped the wheel tighter with every mile. I replayed Romero's words over and over. The land was the only thing left from my parents. The place where Sarah learned to ride a bike, where we planted trees together years ago. It was more than property. It was memory, belonging, love made tangible. The thought that Robert had forged our names to take it made something inside me snap. When I arrived, Romero met me in his small office, closing the door behind us. He handed me the file with a grim expression. The signatures on the papers were shaky imitations of ours. The kind of forgery that might fool an outsider, but not me. He whispered that Robert had delivered the documents himself, claiming we had authorized him to handle the transfer. I clenched the papers in my hands, so tightly they crumpled at the edges. Romero said quietly that someone inside the office must have helped him. That it was risky, even to tell me. I thanked him, promised to keep his name out of it, and left. The moment I stepped outside, the evening wind hit my face like ice. The city around me blurred. For a second, I couldn't tell if I wanted to cry or scream. But as I stood there under the fading light, one thought crystallized: Robert had taken everything he could, except my strength. And now, that was what I'd have to face. I drove straight to Jameis' office, with the file still clutched in my hand. The papers creased and warm from the heat of my anger. The city lights blurred past the windshield, my reflection faint in the glass. I barely noticed the traffic or the sound of the radio murmuring in the background. All I could see were those forged signatures, mine and Sarah's, like scars written in ink. When I arrived, James was waiting. He must have heard the strain in my voice over the phone when I told him I was coming. He motioned for me to sit, and I dropped the file onto his desk. The pages fanned out like a wound opening wider. He read through them silently, his expression darkening with every line. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "This," he said, "is fraud. Plain and simple. Combined with the violence and the infidelity. It's enough to bury him legally." But he warned me again, Robert would fight harder now that everything was at stake. I told him that I wasn't afraid. That fear was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. James nodded, but reminded me that we needed more than rage. We needed precision. He said he'd contact Romero discreetly to verify the internal corruption behind the forged documents. I thanked him, stood up, and turned to leave. But he called after me. "Elizabeth," he said, "take care of yourself. You're not invincible." His voice was kind, but firm. The kind of tone people use when they know you're already too far in to stop. I didn't answer. I just gave a small nod and walked out into the hallway. The elevator ride down felt endless, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror panel, tired eyes, clenched jaw. A woman who had forgotten what rest felt like. When I got home, the house was dim, the lamps casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, flipping absently through an old magazine. She looked up when I walked in, sensing something in my face before I said a word. I told her about the land, about how Robert had stolen not just her peace, but our family's inheritance. Her eyes filled with disbelief first, then fury. She stood up so quickly, the magazine fell from her lap. Her voice cracked as she asked how someone could be so cruel. I didn't have an answer. I just told her that men like him didn't stop until someone made them. I showed her the forged papers, pointing to the shaky signature that pretended to be hers. She stared at it for a long moment, her hands trembling. Then she whispered that the land was where her grandfather used to take her fishing, where we planted the lemon tree still standing by the fence. Her voice broke on that last word, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I took her hand, guiding her to sit beside me. I told her we would get everything back, but more importantly, we would get our dignity back. She nodded, tears slipping down her face silently. After a few minutes, she asked if Robert could go to prison for what he'd done. I said yes. But it wouldn't be easy. He'd try to twist everything. Play the victim. Use his charm like a weapon. Sarah's gaze hardened. She said she wanted to testify. That she didn't want to live in fear anymore. That was the first time I'd heard strength in her voice since that terrible night. I squeezed her hand. Proud, but afraid for her too. I knew what it meant to stand up to someone like him. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I sat in my room going over the evidence again. The light from the desk lamp cut through the darkness, casting a soft glow over the scattered documents. I placed the fraudulent land transfer papers beside the photos of Sarah's bruises, the hospital reports, and the images of Robert with his mistress. Piece by piece, it all formed a story too cruel to ignore. I added a copy of everything into a sealed envelope and hid it inside the lining of my jacket. Just in case. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The sound made the house feel alive, as if it were breathing with me, holding on to the same quiet rage. The next morning, I met Rosales at a small cafe near the station. He was already there, his coffee half finished. He listened as I told him about the forgery, his expression tightening with each detail. He said, "Head, make sure Robert's movements were monitored and that patrols would keep an eye on our house." I handed him a copy of the file. If anything happened to me, I wanted him to have it. He didn't argue, just nodded and slipped it into his briefcase. Before leaving, he said softly that I was walking a dangerous line between justice and revenge. I told him that sometimes the two wore the same face. When I got home, I found Sarah in the kitchen making tea. Her hair tied up, her movements more deliberate than usual. She looked at me with quiet resolve. She asked if we could go to the land, the one Robert had stolen, just to see it again. I hesitated but then agreed. We drove out in silence, the road stretching ahead through fields that shimmered under the afternoon sun. When we reached the gate, the lemon tree still stood there, older now, but alive, its leaves trembling in the breeze. Sarah walked up to it and touched the bark gently, her fingers tracing the scars left by time. She said she remembered the swing her grandfather hung there, the sound of laughter that used to fill the air. I watched her, my throat tightening. I told her we would bring it all back, the land, the peace, the truth. She turned to me, the wind blowing through her hair, and said she believed me. As we drove home, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. But that feeling didn't last long. When we pulled into the driveway, there was an envelope stuck under the front door. I picked it up, recognizing the handwriting instantly. It was Robert's. The message inside was short. "You don't know who you're dealing with." My hands went cold. I folded the note carefully, slid it into the evidence folder, and locked it away. Then I sat down, staring out the window into the growing darkness. Somewhere out there, he was still watching. But so was I. I didn't tell Sarah about the note that night. She had already spent too many nights drowning in fear, and I refused to feed it again. Instead, I tucked her in, sat by her bed until her breathing evened out, then slipped back into the hallway. The house creaked softly with the cool wind pushing against the windows. I stood in the living room, staring at the locked cabinet that held every piece of evidence we'd gathered so far. The weight of it all seemed to pulse behind the wooden door, a silent reminder of the storm waiting to break. I poured myself a small glass of water and walked out onto the porch. The street was quiet, but the quiet itself felt staged, like the pause before an orchestra explodes into sound. The stars above looked faint behind a thin layer of clouds. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. I told myself that fear was a tool. It sharpens you if you learn to hold it right. The next morning, James called to tell me he had secured an appointment with the district court for the following week. That would be the official start of our case: violence, fraud, and property forgery, all tied together. He said he had never seen a file as airtight as ours. I should have felt relief. But instead, a strange stillness settled over me. When people like Robert realize they're losing control, they don't surrender. They lash out. I thanked James, hung up, and started cleaning the kitchen just to keep my hands busy. Sarah came in wearing jeans and one of my old shirts. Her hair brushed neatly for the first time in days. She said she was feeling stronger, that she wanted to help somehow. I told her she already had by surviving. She smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. My stomach tightened. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in uniform Rosalys patrol. He handed me a folder and said quietly that it was from the commander himself. Inside was a brief report. Robert had been seen meeting with a known forger 2 months ago. The name matched the fake notary who had stamped the land documents. It was confirmation that everything we suspected was true. I thanked the officer, closed the door, and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Every thread of Robert's lies was unraveling, and I could almost feel the moment the truth would catch up to him. Later that day, while Sarah was resting, I decided to visit Camila to thank her again for helping us. Her house smelled like cinnamon and laundry soap, the kind of scent that feels like safety. She poured me tea and told me she had been hearing whispers around the neighborhood that Robert was telling people I was abusing my authority, using my badge to destroy him. I felt a chill run through me. It didn't surprise me, but it still stung. The same people who once smiled at me in the market were now probably questioning everything they thought they knew. Camila leaned forward and told me not to worry, that those who mattered knew the truth. Her voice was warm, but the words couldn't drown out the ache inside me. Lies spread faster than justice, and Robert knew exactly how to use that. When I returned home, I found Sarah sitting by the window, scrolling through her phone with a blank expression. She looked up and said softly that people online were talking too, posting rumors that she had fabricated everything for attention. I could see the hurt in her eyes, a pain deeper than any bruise. I sat beside her and told her that the truth always starts as a whisper, but it never stays quiet forever. She nodded, biting her lip, trying not to cry. I wanted to tell her it would all blow over soon, but I'd seen enough of life to know better. That evening, while I was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang again. I wiped my hands and went to the door, half expecting another patrol. But when I opened it, I froze. Standing there was Denise, the woman from the photos. The one in the red dress. Up close. She looked different. The arrogance I remembered was gone, replaced by exhaustion and fear. She asked if she could come in. I hesitated, then stepped aside. Sarah, hearing voices, came into the hallway and stopped cold when she saw her. Denise lowered her gaze and said quietly that she wasn't there to cause trouble, that she needed to talk. We sat at the table, the air so tense I could almost hear it hum. Denise's hands trembled as she spoke. She said Robert had promised her everything: the land, the money, to a future together, but once the papers were signed, he started changing. He became paranoid, cruel. When she threatened to leave, he told her she would go down with him if she ever talked. She showed me a small bruise on her wrist, faint but real. I could feel Sarah's anger rising beside me, but I placed a hand on her arm to keep her calm. Denise looked at me with pleading eyes and said she was ready to testify, that she didn't want to be a part of his lies anymore. I sat back in my chair, studying her. She wasn't innocent, but she was finally telling the truth. And in our fight, that truth was priceless. I told her I'd arrange protection if she agreed to give a full statement to James and Rosales. She nodded quickly, relief flooding her face. As I walked her to the door, she turned to me and whispered that Robert had a plan, something he was preparing if the case went public. Before I could ask what she meant, she shook her head and said she couldn't say more yet. Then she hurried down the steps, disappearing into the fading light. I stood in the doorway, the wind cold against my skin, her words echoing in my head. Robert had a plan. Whatever it was, I knew it wouldn't be mercy. I locked the door behind me and turned off the porch light, my mind already racing. Whatever storm was coming, it was closer than ever. That night, sleep didn't stand a chance. The moment I closed my eyes, Denise's voice replayed in my mind. Robert had a plan. The phrase echoed like a riddle I couldn't solve. I lay awake listening to every sound outside. A passing car, the rattle of wind through the trees, the distant bark of a dog. Each one made my muscles tighten. Around 2 a.m, I got out of bed, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and went to the living room. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, indifferent to everything falling apart in our lives. I opened my laptop again and reviewed the files, photos, hospital records, bank transactions, the land papers. Every piece of evidence we had collected was there. But still, it didn't feel like enough. Robert was desperate now. And desperate men make dangerous moves. At sunrise, I called Rosales. He picked up on the second ring, his voice low and steady. I told him Denise had come to see me, that she was willing to testify, but afraid for her safety. He said he'd handle it, that he would assign an officer to keep watch over her until the hearing. I thanked him and hung up. But the unease didn't leave me. When I turned around, Sarah was standing at the end of the hallway, wrapped in her robe, eyes wide with exhaustion. She asked who I was talking to. I told her it was Rosales, that he was helping us. She nodded slowly, her face pale in the soft morning light. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She had dreamt about Robert again. In her dream, he was standing outside the window, smiling. I forced a reassuring tone, told her it was just her mind playing tricks. But deep down I knew better. Later that day, James called. He said the court date was confirmed for Monday morning, 3 days away. His voice carried a cautious optimism. He told me that with Denise's testimony, the case would be nearly impossible to dispute. He also warned me that Robert had hired an aggressive defense attorney, a man known for twisting stories until the truth bled out of them. I told him I'd be ready. After we hung up, I spent the afternoon reviewing every possible angle they could attack. I rehearsed my testimony aloud, line by line, until my throat was dry. I wasn't just preparing as a mother anymore. I was preparing as a soldier going to war. That evening, while Sarah was showering, I went out to the porch to clear my head. The air smelled of rain, heavy and metallic. I leaned against the railing and looked across the street. Camilla's house lights were off, but her curtains were drawn open just enough for me to see the faint flicker of her television. The normalcy of it comforted me for a second. Then I noticed something: a car parked a few houses down. Engine running. Lights off. My stomach dropped. I watched closely, trying to make out the shape inside. A silhouette moved in the driver's seat, the glow of a cigarette flaring briefly in the dark. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. After a few minutes, the car pulled away slowly, turning the corner without headlights. I stood there frozen for a while, the smell of smoke lingering in the air. When I went back inside, Sarah was sitting on the couch in her pajamas, scrolling through her phone. She looked up at me and asked if something was wrong. I told her everything was fine, that she needed to rest before the trial. But I knew my voice betrayed me. I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and set my phone to record any unusual sounds through the night. The house felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in. I sat in the armchair near Sarah's room, keeping watch like a guard on duty. Around midnight, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the faint sound of movement outside, soft footsteps on gravel. I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped, followed by silence so thick it hurt my ears. I didn't move, just listened, every sense alive. After a few long minutes, the silence broke with the distant rumble of an engine starting. The car was gone again. By morning, my nerves were frayed, but I didn't let Sarah see it. I made breakfast, though neither of us had much appetite. She asked if Denise would really testify. I said yes, though a part of me worried Denise might lose her nerve at the last minute. Sarah said she wanted to face Robert in court, to look him in the eyes when the truth came out. I admired her courage, even as I feared for what that confrontation would do to her. I told her we'd go together, that she wouldn't have to face him alone. The weekend crawled by, each hour heavier than the last. Rosal's sent a car to patrol the street both nights. He called Sunday evening to tell me Robert had been seen near the courthouse, speaking to his lawyer and a few of his men. He told me to stay alert. I said I already was. That night, I went into Sarah's room one last time before bed. She was sitting up, reading quietly. Her bruises faded to pale yellow shadows. I told her she was the bravest person I'd ever known. She smiled faintly, said she just wanted everything to stop. I promised her it would. When the morning of the trial finally came, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of sky that held back its rain until the last possible moment. I ironed my uniform carefully, each crease precise, the badge polished until it caught the light. As I pinned it to my chest, I felt a weight and a clarity settle inside me. Today wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about truth. I walked into Sarah's room, found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking slightly as she tied her shoes. I helped her fix her scarf to cover the last faint bruise on her neck, then looked her in the eye and said, "You don't have to hang your head today." She nodded, tears gathering, but refusing to fall. When we stepped outside, Rosal's patrol car was already waiting. As the door closed behind us, I took one last look at the house that had seen too many sleepless nights and whispered that the next time we came home, peace would follow us through that door. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone walls cold against the gray sky. As Rosales drove, the wipers beat back a thin drizzle that streaked across the windshield. Neither Sarah nor I said a word. The silence between us was heavy but alive, pulsing with everything we didn't need to explain. When we reached the entrance, I stepped out first, my shoes splashing lightly on the wet pavement. The square outside was already crowded. Neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers. Some whispered as we passed, their eyes following us like shadows. I could feel the sting of their judgment, but I kept my head high. Sarah walked close behind me, her hand clutching the small purse where she kept a folded copy of her medical report. Every step she took seemed to carry the weight of years. Inside, the air was cooler, the fluorescent lights too bright. James met us at the hallway near courtroom 3. His tie slightly crooked, his expression steady but tense. He handed me a folder with the final motion papers, whispering that Denise had already arrived and was waiting in a side room under police protection. I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and worry. He said softly that Robert was here too. My heart clenched. I followed his gaze and saw him across the corridor, immaculate suit, freshly cut hair, confidence dripping off him like cologne. For a moment, he met my eyes. His mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach the rest of his face. It was a smile of mockery, a performance for the crowd. I turned away before he could see the anger that was rising inside me. The doors opened, and the murmur of the audience quieted. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and paper. It's familiar in a way that made my chest ache. I had spent years in rooms like this, chasing justice for others. Now, I was the one seated at the front, watching as my life unfolded under the gaze of strangers. The judge entered, his robe crisp, his expression unreadable. Everyone rose, then sat. James began, his voice even, but firm, laying out the charges: domestic harm, fraud, property forgery. Every word struck like a drumbeat. When the video from Camilla's camera played on the large screen, the room fell silent. The image of Sarah standing outside my door in the early hours of the morning filled the space with something electric, something raw. I heard a soft gasp from one of the benches behind us. Sarah's hand found mine under the table, cold and trembling. Robert's lawyer, Valdivia, stood next. His tone was smooth, practiced. He painted Robert as a victim of manipulation, a man destroyed by a vindictive mother-in-law using her badge for revenge. His words twisted reality into something unrecognizable. I could see the faces in the crowd shift, some uncertain, others skeptical. When he accused Sarah of fabricating her injuries, I felt my body tense. James placed a calming hand on my arm, signaling for patience. He let Valdivia talk himself in circles before standing again to present the next piece of evidence, the hospital report signed by Dr. Figueroa, detailing every bruise, every contusion, every cut. The facts cut through the lies like glass. Then came Denise's turn. She walked to the stand slowly, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her eyes downcast. The room held its breath as she spoke. Her voice shook at first, but with each word, it grew steadier. She told the court about the affair, about how Robert had promised her the land in exchange for her silence. She confessed that she had gone along with the fraud at first, but that he had later threatened her when she tried to back out. Every detail was a nail sealing the truth. At one point, Robert slammed his fist on the table, shouting that she was lying. The judge's gavel cracked through the air, ordering him to sit down. Denise flinched, but didn't stop talking. When she finished, the courtroom was silent again, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Sarah's turn came next. I wanted to stand in her place, to shield her from the eyes that watched, but I couldn't. She walked to the witness stand with quiet strength, her voice soft but unwavering. She recounted the night she had come to my door. The way she had felt the moment she realized love had turned into something that wanted to break her. As she spoke, I could see the walls around the people's skepticism begin to crumble. Her words weren't loud, but they carried truth, so pure it silenced everything else. When she said she had run not just to escape him, but to find herself again, I saw even the judge lower his gaze for a moment. Finally, James called me to testify. I stood, my badge catching the light as I approached the stand. My voice was calm, measured, in the way it always was when I needed to stay composed under pressure. I said I was there, not as a police officer, but as a mother. I described what I had seen. The night Sarah appeared at my door. The messages, the forged documents, the threats. I told them how the system I had served for years suddenly felt like a battlefield, one where truth had to fight harder than lies to survive. When I finished, the room was quiet enough to hear the rain starting outside. The judge leaned forward, his hands folded. He took a long pause before speaking. His voice, when it came, was deliberate and clear. He stated that the evidence was overwhelming, that the court found Robert guilty of fraud, falsification of documents, and aggravated domestic abuse. He ordered the immediate freezing of his assets, the nullification of the land transfer, and the issuance of a restraining order protecting Sarah and me. The words rolled over me like a tide. I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Robert's face drained of color, his composure cracking for the first time. Valdivia whispered something to him, but he didn't seem to hear. When the gavel struck for the last time, the sound echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute. I turned to Sarah. She was crying quietly, her shoulders trembling, but her face was calm. I reached for her hand and squeezed it. As we stood to leave, I glanced one last time at Robert, sitting there in silence, the weight of his downfall, finally, settling around him. Outside, the rain had turned into a steady drizzle, washing the dust from the courthouse steps. We stepped out together, mother and daughter, into the cleansing air. For the first time in months, the world felt light again, fragile but real. And as the gray clouds began to break, I knew we were finally free.